Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. The title of my presentation was, as announced in the poster, Strategies and Trends. I added principles because I only have 15 minutes time, so it doesn't matter to add the principles at the beginning. The principal question was already asked: what is architecture? What are we defending? What do we want to promote? And there are two positions which I think are very valuable to differentiate. There is this famous statement by Nikolaus Pevsner: a bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is architecture. So there is a clear divide between architecture as a fine art for the important occasions, and everything else is mere building. Then there are statements like Hans Hollein's also quite famous statement: everything is architecture. So whatever you touch, it could be turned into a work of art. Pevsner has some arguments for his position. So if you look at Lincoln Cathedral, it certainly is more architectural than the bicycle shed on the right-hand side. Lincoln Cathedral is built for God, is built for eternity. The bicycle shed will not survive the next 20 years, it will be gone. But the question is this something we should really accept? Couldn't a shed also turn out to be a work of art? And I want to show some examples. You might know, Assemble is a British team of architects, and the interesting thing is that they won the most prestigious prize for the arts, the Turner Prize for younger artists, in 2015, which was almost a scandal in Britain. So the artists said, well, these are architects, what they're producing is very strange, and so why should we accept this as important contribution to the world of art? And I show a second example. This is a shed for musical rehearsal. And then this is their own workshop, another project. Again, you could say it's nothing more than a shed. The function is completely prosaic. It's a workshop, no cathedral. And still, if you look at this thing for a longer time, you notice there is something strange and something special about this. And the special thing is the tiles, which are handmade. And so if you look closely, if you look at the production, if you talk with people that have visited this building, you understand, well, there is something special here, and is much more than merely building. So I think it is important to understand that art theory has long abandoned this idea that aesthetical features qualify an object to be a work of art, so that you look at something and because you are an expert, because you are trained, because you're an artist, you can say this is art or this is architecture and something else is not. I think some of the speakers before already came up with this question. I think you said, what is quality? How do we defend this? And it's now, art today is rather regarded as an aesthetic practice that has to satisfy certain operational criteria for production and perception. So it's not the artwork per se, but it's the criteria: how has it been produced, how is it received? It's also the side of the reception, which is equally important as the side of productions. You have to take both into account. And the important thing is, what is art about? What do we need it for? The goal of the arts, including architecture, is to foster or to strengthen the self-understanding of individuals, social groups, or society as a whole. If this practice is successful, we can talk about art, we can talk about architecture. Now, the next very logical question is, does this mean that any work of architecture has to be an artwork? If we look around, it's rather naive. Certainly not. But the important thing is, this concept of Baukultur claims that any building or even infrastructure has the potential to be an artwork, regardless of its functional or financial constraints. And the high level of Baukultur in a society means that this potential is widely understood and pursued with ambition. So that people say, we are now producing housing. We know in some cases it is very trivial, but with the same conditions, the same money, it can be something very special, something really amazing. It can be art. And just to give you a small example, and I did this at the conference in Vienna in a much more extended version. These are 6 projects from a region in Austria, from Salzburg. Salzburg was mentioned already with the Salzburg project. This idea of councils for architects, councils where architects support the city in making decisions about planning. And the country of Salzburg, which is one of the federal states, has an architectural prize every 2 years. There is a jury that goes through the country and selects good architecture. And I was part of this jury this year, and we selected 6 projects deliberately with this idea to go from the chapel to the very prosaic workshop. And the small building on the left-hand side is a chapel in the Alps. Then there is a single family house here. There is a rehearsal stage in the city of Salzburg for the theater, so an important public building. There is social housing. This project here is a very interesting social housing project. And there even is infrastructure here. This is no inhabitable building, but it's part of a hydraulic power plant and one of the stations. And here the owner of this power plant said, I don't want just to make a box in the country. This is an important site close to the entrance to my village. This has to be something special and important. And so he decided to give this to architects. The interesting thing is, I did not mention this one here. This is a boulder hall. You know, boulder is a sort of climbing, and it was an existing factory, and the architects refurbished the factory, included a small cafe, and this is something also like a theater. People are watching other people doing strange things, climbing, and this project won the prize for the best work of architecture in the year 2018. And this is the bar inside, and you look, you see this is absolutely trash coming from the trash yard, but still, if you look at the lamps, if you look at the precision with which the bar is executed as a concrete element, if you look closer, you understand that there is an architectural concept behind it. And if somebody without knowledge of architecture would have designed this, it would have looked completely different, absolutely prosaic. So what does good architecture need? It's a very simple triangle: ambitious clients, a good brief, so these clients have to be able to say what they want or which process they want to proceed to get to a good results, and principled architects. I don't say good architects, this is not enough. Architects need principles. And with these 3 elements, it is possible to create something like a good Baukultur in the country. So the Austrian situation is probably not so similar to the Czech situation because we're doing this bottom-up mainly. So this is rather a grassroots development that later, after 10 to 15 years, catched up with the political establishment and got support from that side. And I want to start with the measures which I think are really important to promote good architecture. Is this catalogue of Best of Austria, which is a collection of all the projects that within the past 2 years won some of the prizes for good architecture in Austria. So I mentioned before, Salzburg has a prize for architecture. Many federal states have their own. There is a prize awarded by the Chamber of Architects to good clients. It's called the Bauherrenpreis. The most prestigious prize for architecture in Austria is placing special importance on the role of the client, so it's called the Client Prize for Architecture. And there are about 50 prizes of different sizes, and all the winners are collected in these books that appear every 2 years in Austria since 2008. Then there are the architectural centers in Austria. Each federal state has its own, and you see here the name of the institution and the year it was founded. Vorarlberg, which is certainly one of the most advanced countries, federal states in Austria, was one of the latest to install a sort of architectural center. The first one was the Austrian Society for Architecture in Vienna. I think the second one then was in Graz. This was always a polar situation between Vienna and Graz with a lot of competition. Then there is the same thing in Carinthia, a very good one in Innsbruck in Tyrol. And these institutions have developed over the past 20 years, some of them really into museums, into small institutions that work like a museum. I think it is important for architecture to have these places, because in music you have the concert hall and you have the society of music lovers, which are taking care of the art of music. In architecture, you say architecture is everywhere in the public, but it is also necessary that you have some places, some institutions that are the institutions of architecture lovers who really try to promote the discipline, to discuss the discipline, and to have their own place, their own location, their own situation. And these architectural centers are funded partly by the state, partly by the federal states, partly by the municipalities they are housed in, and they have a very important role for the development of architecture in the federal states, because architecture is produced, is conceived locally on the level of the municipality. And if you don't have strong institutions there, you can do everything on the top level and produce nice papers, but you won't get your feet on the ground, which I think is really important here. These centers are meeting places for clients and architects and people from the municipality. They create networks, and these networks are absolutely necessary to produce good quality. Beyond laws, everything has to be on a good level, but these networks of quality, including the builders, including the people who execute the buildings, are of enormous importance. Then this is an image of the wider institutional landscape of architectural policy in Austria. The strange thing is that here in the center is a platform for Baukultur, and it looks like this is the most powerful institution, but actually it is an institution absolutely without power. It has a budget of 30,000 euros per year, which is nothing, but it is a connecting platform of the Chamber of Architects, of the universities, and of all these institutions for architectural centers, architectural museums. And they meet twice a year. This is a very strong network where everybody talks with each other. And if elections are coming up, then this platform is inviting the politicians, organizing conferences, as you also have done some years ago, trying to get the politicians into the boat of promoting quality. Then this is the state government level and the Federal Council for Baukultur, which I am chairing in the Federal Chancellery. It is a very large council of about 40 people, including representatives of all the ministries and of the federal states, of NGOs from the Chamber of Architects to small institutions that are interested in promoting architecture. This council meets 3 times a year. It has the potential to organize the Baukultur report, a report on Baukultur every 5 years, and it has produced this report last year, and it has also produced federal guidelines for building culture, federal guidelines for Baukultur also this year, which are relevant on the level of the state. The interesting experience we had with this council was that at the beginning, if we had representatives from the ministries, for example, for healthcare, the representatives said, we have no idea what we have to do with architecture. We're dealing with healthcare. And then after some years, it turned out, well, you're building hospitals, you're an important client, and health is something related to town planning, is related to architecture. And they said, oh yes, this is true, we're part of this network. And it turned out that every ministry has in some way or the other a relationship to Baukultur. Even the people who build power lines in the landscape are dealing with important questions of landscape design, and the people who build highways are dealing with similar problems. And it turned out that some of them began to install quality councils, for example, for highway design. Yes, now this is another piece of theory. What are the policy fields that we are dealing with? There is cultural and societal policy, and the key aspect is identity. This is where architecture is usually positioned. But there is also economic policy, and the key aspect here is efficiency. So how can you work as efficiently as possible with public money? So this is an important criterion. And there is, on the same level, energy and environmental policy with the key aspect of sustainability. And usually these policy fields are quite separated, and people do not take them into account as something that actually should be one whole, one thing that is intensely interrelated. And this is something we try to promote at the moment. One measure of promotion is this Baukultur report. There were 2 reports before. The 2 reports before, one was in 2006, one in 2011, and it took us more than 5 years to produce the latest one. And the first one was a general overview over the situation in Austria. The second one was divided into 3 parts. One was education, one was sustainability, and the third part was the power of the local administration. And in both reports, we produced recommendations, a lot of recommendations, 45 recommendations, nice words, how to create quality. And we found out that these recommendations were repeated by people, but they were not used, actually. So we thought for the third Baukultur report, we should do it differently and not produce any recommendations anymore, but to make a scenario discussion about the future of Austria in the year 2050. And we had 2 large sessions with about 200 people that built teams and thought, what is the worst thing and the best thing that could happen in the development over the next 30 years? And we then divided this into topics, discussed them again, and we came up with 3 scenarios. How could Austria look in 2050? And this is not a realistic idea and a realistic prognosis, but it's just the idea to make something like a piece of literature, to think which extremes could we reach, what could really happen. So the one idea is the integral scenario focused on the common good, on quality, on energy sustainability, and everybody should be happy in this kind of society. The second option is the national scenario. So how will we live? In this scenario, Austria leaves the European Union, closes the borders again, the population is shrinking, you don't need much more building. All the planning is done by builders and not so much architects. The aesthetics is very retro in some way, and we are a happy island again, blocked against the rest of the world. This is, we talked about this is the urbanization of Austria, so the idea of following the Hungarian model rather, and then finally really getting out of the European community. Then this is the neoliberal scenario, the idea that the national state is still there because it is very useful for the global institutions and for the global companies, but the power of this national state is restricted to a very few aspects. Economic power is really the most driving force, and public housing is not existing anymore, so you have a very strong divide in society. In terms of regional planning, the big centers will grow and the land, the small municipalities will lose more and more people. So these are these 3 scenarios, and they are very deeply described and argued in the Baukultur report. And we are now starting to talk with politicians. Where do you want this country to go? Do you know that you are contributing to these developments? Decisions you take today will lead to one of these 3 models. And it's very interesting to discuss this with politicians. And instead of very small recommendations, we came up with 5 strategic recommendations. We wanted to restrict it to 4 or 5 points. And maybe this sounds very trivial to you, but it is useful with politicians who need simple questions. So the first strategic recommendation is strengthen the awareness for Baukultur and create an effective institutional landscape. So what I was talking about, strengthen the architectural centers, produce something that people understand that this is an important discipline, that this is an important artistic discipline, and that you are also changing and influencing society. Serve the common good with whatever you do. This is a clear statement to politicians. If the European Union tries to reduce public housing, in Vienna, for example, 60% of the people live in housing with some public subsidies, erected or built with public money, partially at least. So this is serving the common good, and this is a question you should ask yourself as a politician. Whenever you build a new highway, does this really serve the public good on the long term, or doesn't it? The strategic recommendation number 3 is to promote holistic, long-term and innovative planning and design. So these arguments were deliberately chosen. Holistic, think on the whole. Long-term, think on the long-term, on the consequences of what you're doing now, and try to be innovative, use innovative planning tools, don't try to stick to the models of the past. The 4th recommendation, use land and other resources with care. This is an aspect of sustainability, but we are now learning that land is really the crucial point. Land is the question, where can you build housing? Is there enough housing? Land relates to energy. If you build large energy, photovoltaic plants, they use land again. So land is really a crucial thing, but land and other resources should be used with care. And the strategic recommendation number 5, bind public subsidies to quality criteria, means that if public money is used somewhere to build a new stadium, to build housing with public subsidies, you have to install measures for quality management and argue that this is our money that is being used, so you need a quality control, and at least you have to discuss about quality criteria and then try to fulfill them. So this is on the very top level the message we now want to promote to the politicians. There is a finer grained aspect too. These are the federal guidelines for Baukultur that the federal government adopted in August 2017, but this was the last government, but luckily the current government included these guidelines into its manifesto. So this is also part of the national strategy at the moment. I cannot go into detail here, but these are guidelines that are now implemented at the level of all the ministries. Everything that is on the public level of the federal state is at least trying to follow these guidelines. And these are not only sentences with abstract descriptions, but an integral part of the guideline are milestone projects, about 20 milestone projects that have to be realized, or at least can be monitored over the next 5 years. And at the moment, the federal states, the single states, Salzburg, for example, they are now preparing their own guidelines for Baukultur. So the idea is now spreading also from bottom up into the official institutions that are responsible for architecture in Austria. I hope this was not too long. Thank you very much for your patience.